A millionaire spots a little girl weeping in the rain cradling a baby. What they reveal next leaves him stunned. Raindrops hammered the windshield of Harold Livingston's classic Ford Mustang, the steady rhythm nearly overpowering his own swirling thoughts. Dallas's usually lively, narrow cobblestone streets now lay deserted beneath the heavy rain. The historic buildings with their ivy-draped walls and intricate ironwork seemed to dissolve into the shadowed gloom, creating a ghostly, silent landscape. His mind, as stormy as the scene outside, churned with restlessness. Fame, power, wealth. He'd achieved it all. Yet an emptiness persisted, an ache that money and success could never soothe. It was a kind of hollowness that lingered in quiet moments like this, when the only company he had was the storm and his own thoughts as he approached a red light. Gently pressing the brake, he gazed out at the rain-soaked blur of the familiar town. Something drew his attention to the side, where an alleyway cut through the row of historic structures. At first, it seemed like just another shadow cast by the dim streetlights, but something made him look again. Against the wall, barely visible through the rain, a small figure huddled. Harold squinted, trying to make sense of the scene. The figure was far too small to be an adult. An unexpected jolt of concern struck him as he realized it was a child, a young girl, maybe 8 or 9, drenched by the rain. She was holding something even smaller in her arms. Every instinct told him to look away, to act as though he hadn't seen anything. People like him weren't supposed to get involved in these things. But something about that tiny, shivering form triggered a forgotten sense of responsibility, a feeling he hadn't acknowledged in years. He turned the Mustang into the alley, tires splashing through the puddles. The girl's eyes, wide with fear and desperation, locked onto the approaching car, but she didn't move. Harold, parked a short distance away, stepped out and felt the cold rain soak his expensive coat. Walking slowly to avoid frightening her, he called out gently, "Hey," his voice softer than he'd expected. "Are you all right?" the man asked, noticing how tightly she held the little bundle in her arms. It was clear now. She was carrying a baby. Her eyes, a mix of fear and desperation, met his, and something in Harold softened, a tiny break in the emotional wall he had fortified over the years. "I'm not going to hurt you," he assured her, bending down to meet her gaze, rain dripping down his face and obscuring his vision. "I just want to help. It's not safe out here." The girl looked between him and the baby, hesitant, her eyes darting with uncertainty. Finally, she gave a small, frightened nod. Without fully grasping why, Harold reached for her hand, gently guiding her toward his car. As they settled into the car, Harold sensed that this moment was significant, a shift in his life that was just beginning to reveal itself. He glanced in the rearview mirror, watching the children in silence, the only sound the soft rhythm of rain against the car's roof. The drenched streets of Dallas passed by in a blur as he continued to steal glances at the girl in the back seat, cradling her baby brother close, her eyes wide and vigilant. "I'm Harold," he said softly, breaking the silence in a calm, steady tone. "What's your name?" She tensed, clutching the baby's blanket tightly, then whispered, "Laura." Her voice was almost lost beneath the hum of the engine. "And this is Logan," she added. Harold nodded, quietly repeating their names, as though anchoring them in his mind. "It's nice to meet you, Laura." He offered a warm reassurance. "You're safe here." She didn't answer, but her watchful eyes remained fixed on him, scrutinizing his every move. When they arrived, the large, well-decorated house that reflected Harold's successful life suddenly felt strangely empty and unwelcoming. The walls, adorned with pricey art and decor, only emphasized the coldness of the space. He could feel the gap that fear and unfamiliarity had created between himself and the kids. Guiding them into the living room, Harold tried to make the environment less intimidating. "Let's get you warmed up," he said, heading to a closet stocked with blankets. "I'll find some dry clothes for you too." Laura held her ground, clinging tightly to Logan as if afraid he might be swept away any second. Harold took a step back, noticing the exhaustion in her eyes. "It's okay," he said gently. "I'm just grabbing some blankets. I'll be right here." In a few moments, he was back, handing her a soft blanket and a couple of his old sweatshirts. "They might be a little big, but they're warm," he said, attempting a light-hearted tone. Laura accepted them without a word, keeping her gaze fixed on him as she wrapped Logan up before slipping into one of the oversized sweatshirts herself. Harold experienced a pain he hadn't felt in years at the sight of her, a tiny figure engulfed by his clothing. It struck him that he was clueless about caring for kids, especially ones who'd endured the kind of hardships Laura had. But the look in her eyes, quietly pleading for safety, drove him to try. "Are you hungry?" he asked, adding, "We could go find something to eat." Laura hesitated, then nodded slowly. Harold felt a small lift in his heart, a minor win, but still a start. At Mrs. Griffin's cafe, a welcoming spot where the aroma of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the scent of cinnamon rolls and the crackling fireplace, Harold's focus was solely on the small girl seated across from him. Laura, bundled in his old sweater, looked even smaller than she had last night. Her large, watchful eyes seemed to take everything in, mingling caution with curiosity. Logan, now fast asleep in a stroller Mrs. Griffin had kindly lent them, rested close beside her. Harold observed them, his mind replaying Laura's words from earlier. Brenda, she was in charge. She didn't like us. She made us leave. The sentence echoed in Harold's thoughts, unsettling him deeply. What kind of orphanage would cast children like Laura and Logan out onto the streets? He had tried to ask more, but her responses were hesitant, her voice breaking as she recounted the chill, hunger, and fear they faced afterward. As he absent-mindedly stirred his coffee, Harold's mind drifted to the orphanage itself, Greenwood Children's Home. He'd driven by it countless times, an imposing structure set back from the road with barred windows and high walls. He'd always thought of it as a gloomy spot, but until now, he hadn't given it much weight. The notion that this place might conceal cruelty, that it could be a breeding ground for suffering instead of a haven, gnawed at him. He glanced at Laura again, noticing how her gaze darted around the cafe, her body stiff, and her hands resting protectively on Logan's stroller. A surge of protectiveness swelled in Harold, something he hadn't felt before. These kids were under his care now, and the thought of them being mistreated stoked a quiet but simmering anger within him. "What else can you share about Brenda?" Harold asked gently, careful not to press Laura too hard, but wanting to piece together the story. Laura hesitated, twisting the edge of her sleeves. She didn't really care about us," she finally said. "Sometimes we barely had enough to eat. It was always cold, and sometimes we had to sleep on the floor. If we upset her..." Harold's grip on his coffee cup tightened, the warmth of the porcelain grounding him. He'd seen neglect before, but hearing it from Laura in her small, frightened voice made it real. He felt a shift within, the part of him that usually stayed distant from others' problems beginning to crack. "I'm sorry, Laura," Harold said, his voice calm and steady. "No one should have treated you or Logan like that, but I want you to know you're safe now. I'll make sure of it." Laura nodded, but her eyes remained cautious, her trust still fragile and tentative. Harold understood that winning her trust would take time, but he was ready to be patient. For now, he had to focus on what he could control, starting with finding out more about Greenwood and this woman named Brenda. The decision settled in his mind like a stone in water, creating ripples that spread outward. Harold knew he couldn't ignore this. He would investigate the orphanage, uncover its past, and figure out why a place intended to protect children had instead become a place of fear. Harold Livingston pushed open the heavy wooden doors of Dallas's City Hall, the scent of old paper and musty air greeting him as he stepped inside. The space was filled with an oppressive silence that detracted from the building's elegance, which featured high ceilings and intricate moldings. This was a place where history was preserved, not challenged, a place where secrets could easily disappear beneath layers of red tape. He approached the front desk, where a clerk with thinning hair and wire-framed glasses looked up from a stack of papers. The clerk's expression barely masked his impatience, as if Harold's presence was disrupting the real work of upholding the status quo. "Can I help you?" the clerk asked, his voice implying he was hoping for a quick no. Harold, determined, kept his voice, even as he replied, "I'm looking for information on Greenwood Children's Home." He anticipated some pushback and was ready to handle it. Specifically, records from the past decade. The clerk frowned, adjusting his glasses. "And why, exactly, would you need that?" Harold paused briefly, choosing his words with care. "It's for a personal matter I'm looking into. It's important." The clerk eyed him, a blend of curiosity and caution crossing his face. "That's sensitive information. You'd need a solid reason, maybe even some official paperwork." Harold leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "I'm not here to make waves. I just want to understand more about what's going on there. I think there might be issues, and if the records can shed any light on that, I'd really appreciate your help." After a tense pause, the clerk exhaled, seeming to waver. "Fine," he mumbled, glancing around as if to make sure they were alone. "I'll let you see them. But you didn't get this from me. Got it?" Harold nodded, relieved. "Got it." The clerk led him into a back room lined with metal filing cabinets. The fluorescent lights flickered above, casting a stark, unwelcoming glow over dusty folders and long-forgotten records. He opened one of the drawers and pulled out a stack of files, handing them to Harold with a resigned expression. "Here's everything we have on Greenwood from the last 10 years. Good luck finding whatever you're looking for." Harold thanked him and settled at a nearby table, the weight of the files feeling both literal and symbolic. As he opened the first folder, he quickly took in the initial details. Greenwood had been founded by a woman named Christina Leach, whose reputation for compassion and commitment to the children had earned her admiration. The early records overflowed with praise from the community, affirming her dedication and the positive impact of her work. As Harold delved further, he noticed a disturbing shift in the record's tone. Christina Leach had passed away unexpectedly 5 years prior, and soon after, Brenda Dudley stepped in as the new director of the orphanage. The changes began subtly. Financial statements revealed unexplained spending, legal paperwork carried ambiguous phrasing, and staff complaints were quietly ignored. Harold's concern grew as he traced the emerging pattern. Under Brenda's leadership, Greenwood was transforming, from a safe haven for children into a profit-driven enterprise. Donations poured in, yet the funds vanished into untraceable accounts. Several children were transferred out of the orphanage without proper records, leaving their whereabouts a mystery. Hours slipped by as Harold combed through the evidence, his resolve hardening with each unsettling discovery. It was clear that something was deeply wrong at Greenwood, and the town's indifference had allowed it to persist, unchallenged. Finally, Harold closed the last file, feeling the weight of his findings press upon him. Outside, the sun was setting, casting elongated shadows through the City Hall windows. Harold stood, now with a clear sense of purpose. As he exited the building, the quiet around him felt oppressive, heavy, with Greenwood's buried secrets. He knew that whatever was happening had to be stopped, and he was the only one who would take it on. At home, what was once his peaceful retreat now felt like a besieged stronghold. The heavy curtains were drawn tightly, shutting out the world, and the dim evening light cast long shadows across the polished floors. An overwhelming tension settled in his chest as he moved with purpose through the rooms, collecting papers, making calls, bracing for the storm he knew was near. In his study, documents covered the large oak desk, each piece of paper a part of the puzzle he was painstakingly assembling. But it wasn't enough. He needed help. He needed someone who could navigate Dallas's shadowy undercurrents. That someone was Henry Murphy. Harold lifted the phone, his fingers hovering above the keypad as he weighed the enormity of his next move. Henry wasn't just any friend. He was a man who'd seen the depths of human wrongdoing. Yet, asking for his help meant crossing a line Harold wasn't sure he could come back from. With a determined exhale, he punched in the number, his grip tightening on the receiver as he listened to the ringing. Murphy. The person on the other end of the line had a gruff, no-nonsense voice that belied his years of experience in law enforcement. Henry. "It's Harold," he greeted, keeping his tone even. "I need to talk. It's serious." A pause followed, brief yet telling, enough for Harold to know Henry was already piecing things together in his mind, already assessing the implications. Finally, Henry replied, "All right. Where and when?" "Tonight at my place. I'll lay it all out then." "I'll be there in an hour." The line clicked, and Harold lowered the phone, feeling the weight of his decision settle over him like a cold fog. He drifted to the study window, parting the curtains just enough to scan the quiet street below. The recent rain left the pavement glistening, streetlights casting reflections. But Harold knew better than to rely on appearances. An hour later, the doorbell cut through the silence, sharp and insistent. Harold opened the door, and there was Henry, his coat damp from the renewed drizzle, his gaze sharp and focused. "Harold," Henry greeted him with a curt nod, stepping inside and shedding his coat. "What's this all about?" Without a word, Harold led him to the study, the tension between them thickening with each step. In the study, he pointed to the desk scattered with documents. "This," he said simply. Henry stepped closer, his eyes narrowing as he examined the financial records, legal file, and complaints, filed and forgotten. He picked up a folder, flipping through it with the practiced eye of someone far too familiar with corruption. "You've been busy," Henry noted, his voice even. "Not busy enough," Harold replied, his tone heavy. "Greenwood Children's Home, it's not what it looks like, Henry. Brenda Dudley. Something sinister is happening there. I've seen enough to know, but I need your help to dig deeper." Henry closed the file, meeting Harold's eyes with a look that gave nothing away. "You understand what you're getting yourself into, right? This isn't just some messed-up charity case. If what you're telling me is accurate, we're dealing with something far more dangerous." "I know," Harold replied, his voice firmer than he felt inside. "But those kids, Laura and Logan, they've been through hell and back. I can't just turn my back on them now." Henry watched him closely, the silence stretching long and heavy between them. Finally he nodded, slowly and deliberately. "All right, Harold. I'll start looking into it quietly. But you better be careful. Tugging on these strings might unravel more than you're ready for." Harold took a steady breath. "I'm prepared for that," he said, though his gut twisted with doubt. Henry tucked the files into his coat pocket. "I'll get in touch," he said as he moved toward the door. Just before leaving, he turned back, his expression softening. "You're doing the right thing, but it's going to be a rough road. Watch your back." The door closed behind him, leaving the house steeped in silence once more. Harold stood alone in his study, the gravity of it all weighing on him. He took a seat at his desk, his gaze fixed on the empty spot where the files had been moments before. He felt the full scope of his task, the children's safety, the secrets buried deep within Greenwood, the dangerous powers he was challenging. It was his burden now, and he had no choice but to see it through, no matter the cost. Moving through Dallas's streets, a creeping tension built within him, weighed down by the gravity of what he was uncovering. The city, a mix of old southern charm and new wealth, seemed to hold its breath as he ventured further into the unknown. Raindrops glistened on the wet streets, reflecting the faint glow of streetlights, casting an other-worldly feel, as though he were wandering through a maze of secrets hidden in plain sight. His first stop was a dimly lit bar on the outskirts of town, the kind of place where deals were murmured and handshakes went unnoticed. The bartender, a muscular man with a tattoo just visible under his rolled-up sleeve, gave Harold a wary look as he ordered his drink. When Harold discreetly passed a folded bill to the bartender and inquired about Brenda Dudley, he noticed an immediate change in the man's face. "She's got friends in high places," the bartender murmured, leaning in closer. "Not someone you'd want to cross if you know what's good for you. People who go up against her, well, they don't stick around." Harold nodded, taking in the warning. It was as he had feared. Brenda wasn't just running a shady orphanage. She was intricately tied into a powerful network that extended far beyond the borders of Greenwood. But he needed more than whispers and gossip. He needed solid evidence. His investigation led him through a series of late-night meetings in smoke-filled back rooms and shadowy offices, where every corner reeked of stale cigarettes and dirty money. Each encounter painted a more vivid image of the tangled web Brenda had spun around herself. Prominent local businessmen, city officials, and even members of law enforcement all had reasons to keep Greenwood under wraps. The orphanage was nothing but a front for something darker, a stepping stone for Brenda's far-reaching scheme. With each connection he uncovered, Harold's sense of unease grew stronger. Brenda's power wasn't just rooted in her influence, it thrived on fear. Those who dared oppose her were crushed by a system rigged to protect its own. And in the middle of it all were innocent kids like Laura, Logan, and so many others, pawns trapped in a game they couldn't even comprehend. Late one evening, Harold found himself in the office of a real estate developer infamous for his murky dealings. The man was polished and persuasive, but the pressure of Harold's probing questions broke through his smooth facade. He let slip a detail that chilled Harold to the core. Brenda had been transferring children across state lines, placing them in private homes without any oversight. The implications were unmistakable, and they were terrifying. Harold left that meeting with his stomach in knots, his thoughts in turmoil. He had just enough to confirm his worst suspicions, but it wasn't enough to topple Brenda. Not yet. He needed undeniable proof, paper trails, witness accounts, anything that could reveal the full scale of her operation. But as he strolled down the quiet streets, Harold couldn't shake the sensation that someone was watching him. The night felt unnaturally thick, the shadows too dark, the silence pressing. Brenda knew he was closing in, and he had no illusions about the danger that now surrounded him. He returned home with one overpowering thought. This was bigger than he ever anticipated. Brenda Dudley was merely the visible face of a much larger machine, one that wouldn't be taken down without a fight. But backing out wasn't an option now. Too much was on the line. The gates of Greenwood Children's Home towered before him, a structure that once promised warmth and care, but now gave off a cold, daunting presence. Harold Livingston felt a shiver as he climbed out of his car, the iron gates clanging shut behind him. The building's towering walls and barred windows made it look more like a fortress than a sanctuary. This place seemed designed to lock away secrets, not nurture children. He squared his shoulders, steeling himself for what lay ahead, and strode to the front entrance. Under the pretense of a potential donor, he knew this visit was a risk, a carefully calculated one, but still a gamble. He would need to stay sharp, keep his cover intact, and gather whatever he could without drawing suspicion. Before he could knock, the door swung open, and there stood Brenda Dudley, her face giving nothing away. She was a tall woman with strikingly sharp features, her gaze intense, as if it could see straight through him. Her smile was thin, a symbol of control rather than welcome. "Mr. Livingston, welcome to Greenwood," she said, extending a hand as cold as her expression. "I understand you're interested in supporting our mission here." Harold shook her hand, keeping his face impassive. "Yes, Miss Dudley, I've heard quite a bit about this place, and I wanted to see it for myself." Brenda's eyes flickered, a flash of something hidden crossing her face. "We're always grateful for new support," she said smoothly. "Let me show you around." She guided him through the orphanage with a well-practiced, almost robotic tone, describing each room as they went. The building was immaculate, perhaps too immaculate, yet it felt void of the energy and coziness usually present in places where children lived. The walls were bare, the furniture sparse, and the children they passed in the hallways moved quietly, with an air of defeat that gnawed at Harold's core. He glanced at them as they walked by, catching brief looks of fear, confusion, and resignation. These were not the faces of well-nurtured children. They were the faces of the invisible, the neglected. "This is our common room," Brenda announced as they entered a large, empty-feeling space. A few kids sat around tables, coloring or reading, but their movements were lethargic and their eyes vacant. "We strive to create a supportive atmosphere here." Harold nodded, though his mind was whirling. Every detail, every minor inconsistency he noticed only strengthened his suspicions. Yet he couldn't let it show, not just yet. "So how do you handle funding for this place?" he asked, guiding the conversation toward his real purpose. "I'm interested to know how an operation like this keeps itself afloat." Brenda paused, just for a split second, but it was enough for Harold to catch. "We primarily depend on donations, naturally," she replied, her tone carefully even. "But we also get grants and assistance from nearby businesses. We're quite fortunate." Harold continued with subtle, seemingly harmless questions, designed to dig deeper. He watched as her responses grew shorter and her stance a little more rigid. The tension thickened, a quiet clash of wills. Finally, Brenda's polite smile faltered, her gaze sharpening. "You're asking a lot, Mr. Livingston," she said, her tone edged with challenge. "What exactly are you looking for?" Harold held her stare, keeping his voice steady. "Just trying to understand where my investment would be going, Miss Dudley. I like to know what I'm getting behind." A long silence settled between them, heavy with unspoken doubt. Then Brenda's smile returned, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Of course," she said, turning away. "Shall we continue?" Harold's mind was racing with everything he had seen and heard as the rest of the tour flew by. By the time they reached the entrance, he was certain the situation at Greenwood was far darker than he'd suspected. As he stepped out, Brenda's words followed him. "Thank you for your interest, Mr. Livingston. We look forward to your support." Harold forced a polite smile, the weight of what he had to do sinking in. "I'll be in touch," he replied, making his way to his car. The gates closed behind him, as though shutting off access to a fortress of secrets. Harold knew he had to act fast before Brenda realized just how much he'd uncovered. The children's safety was at stake, and time was slipping away. His quiet home had turned into a command center, papers and maps cluttering the study, each piece bringing him closer to exposing the grim reality lurking behind Greenwood's doors. The soft glow of the desk lamp threw shadows across the room, adding weight to the heavy tension hanging in the air. Henry Murphy, his brow furrowed in concentration, leaned over a map of Dallas spread out on the desk. "We've got to be precise," he muttered, tapping a particular spot with his finger. "If we make our move too soon, we risk tipping her off," he continued. "But if we wait too long," Harold's voice trailed, completing the thought, "she'll relocate the kids, and we'll miss our shot." Murphy nodded, his face grim. "Brenda isn't one to sit around and wait for us to catch up. If she catches wind of this, she'll disappear, and she's got the means to make that happen. We've got to move quickly, but we can't afford any missteps." Harold's thoughts raced as he sifted through the pile of evidence on the desk. Every file and photo suggested something darker than he'd originally expected. The stakes had never been higher, and the weight of it all pressed down on him in a way he wasn't used to. "There's no room for mistakes," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Those kids have already been through enough. We can't let them slip away now." Murphy straightened up, arms crossed, weighing their options. "We need undeniable evidence, something solid enough to compel the authorities to act. If we go in half-prepared, she'll find a way to slip through. And those kids, they'll suffer for it." A familiar anxiety gripped Harold's chest. He was no stranger to high-stakes decisions in the business world, but this was entirely different. This wasn't about gains or losses. This was about lives, innocent lives depending on him to make the right call. He glanced at the clock on the wall, the ticking a steady reminder that time was slipping away. "We need to go through every last detail," he said, determination sharpening his voice. "There's got to be something here, some leverage we've missed." The room fell into a tense silence, broken only by the rustle of paper and the scratch of a pen as they combed through the documents. Harold's concentration was unwavering, his mind scanning every clue, every piece of evidence, trying to put the last piece of the puzzle into place. Suddenly, the phone rang, cutting through the quiet like a knife. Harold grabbed it, his heart pounding. "Livingston," he answered. Harold's voice was tense, clipped. On the other end, a low, urgent whisper warned, "Brenda's planning to move the kids tonight. A private jet is set to leave Dallas's airstrip at dawn." Harold's grip tightened on the phone. "There's no time." Murphy looked up, catching the urgency in Harold's eyes. "What's going on?" Harold hung up, his resolve solidified. "She's moving them tonight. We need to go now." Murphy nodded, reaching for his coat. "Then we'll make sure she doesn't get away with it." As they strode to the door, the weight of the mission pressed down on Harold. Time was running out, and the kids' lives were at stake. But he was ready, and so was Murphy. This was their chance to bring Brenda's reign of terror to an end. The night was thick with tension as Harold, Murphy, and the team of officers approached Greenwood Children's Home. Clouds obscured the moon's light, making the office's dark silhouette barely discernible against the sky. Harold's heart pounded in his chest. Each step toward the building felt heavier. There was no turning back now. Murphy held up a hand, signaling the team to halt. His voice was a low murmur in the night. "We move fast, we move quiet. No mistakes." Though his words were calm and professional, Harold sensed the urgency behind them. Harold nodded, gripping his flashlight, his breathing steady as he focused. They'd mapped out every detail, but now it was up to their execution, and maybe a bit of luck. The team spread out, blending into the shadows as they approached the side entrance of the orphanage. Murphy and Harold moved in unison, the wet grass muffling their footsteps. When they reached the door, Murphy gestured to an officer who swiftly went to work on the lock. The faint click of the lock disengaging seemed deafening, but the door swung open smoothly. Inside, the stale air carried a heavy scent of neglect. Darkness enveloped the hallways, broken only by the dim glow of the emergency exit signs. Harold's senses were on edge. Every creak and every faint sound heightened his pulse, sending surges of adrenaline through him. They moved quickly through the building, navigating each corner with careful precision. Each door opened with a silent hope for safety. Once a haven, the orphanage now felt like a labyrinth filled with lurking threats. Harold's mind was racing. He thought of the kids, wondering where they were, how they were holding up, and if they were out of harm's way. Time was slipping by. As they approached the main wing, the tension in the air grew heavier. This was where Brenda's office was, the place where they'd likely find the crucial records, and maybe even encounter Brenda herself. Murphy glanced at Harold, his silent question evident. "Are you ready?" Harold steadied himself, suppressing the fear that threatened to seep in. "Let's get this done," he murmured. They moved forward, the office door looming ahead, but as they drew closer, it swung open suddenly. One of Brenda's heavy guards charged at them, and chaos erupted in the hallway. Murphy responded immediately, tackling the guard before he could get his weapon ready, the two crashing to the ground in a heap. "Go!" Murphy yelled, grappling with the man. Harold paused, his instinct to help his friend clashing with the urgency to press on with the mission. Breaking free from hesitation, he pushed ahead as more guards emerged from the shadows, intensifying the fight around him. The office door was slightly ajar, light spilling into the hallway. Harold dashed in, his heart pounding. Brenda stood behind her desk, her expression hardened with anger. "You're too late," she sneered, her gaze filled with contempt. Harold skipped the words, launching himself toward the stack of papers on her desk. But Brenda was faster, pulling a gun from a drawer, her hand trembling as she pointed it at him. "You're not getting away with this," she spat. Harold froze, desperately searching for a way out. Just as she was about to pull the trigger, a gunshot shattered the silence, and she dropped to the floor, clutching her shoulder. Murphy stood at the doorway, his gun still smoking. "Go," he ordered, his tone a mixture of urgency and relief. Harold grabbed the papers and sprinted, his mind a whirlwind of determination and fear. They had to save those kids. Barreling down the hallway, he burst into the dormitory, where the children sat huddled together, eyes wide with fear. "It's okay," Harold assured them, his voice steady, despite the surrounding chaos. "You're safe now." Harold's voice was firm yet gentle, and the children stared at him, unsure, but beginning to feel the truth in his words. Slowly, they moved toward him, hesitant, but seeking the comfort he offered. As they stepped closer, Harold's heart swelled with a fierce sense of protectiveness and determination. They had made it. They had reached them in time. As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, casting a pale glow over the old building, Harold led the children out, each step feeling like a small victory. Brenda was in custody, and though relief washed over him, he knew deep down that this was only the beginning. The network behind Greenwood was vast, still lurking out there in the shadows, and the battle was far from over. Back in his study that afternoon, the warm sunlight filtered through the tall windows, painting a serene glow across the room. Once a chaotic space filled with clues and files, his office had returned to a sense of calm, though traces of the intense days still lingered. Boxes of files were stacked in the corner, documents awaiting the final touches of a long legal process. Harold gazed out the window at Dallas, the town that had become the unexpected setting for a chapter of his life he hadn't anticipated. In the week since the operation at Greenwood, his days had been a whirlwind of legal wrangling, relentless media attention, and personal reflection. The network they'd uncovered reached far beyond Greenwood, a monstrous machine of fear and manipulation that would take time to dismantle. Brenda Dudley's reign of terror was over, but Harold knew that systemic change would require patience, persistence, and unwavering resolve. But today, he allowed himself a moment to breathe, to savor the small but powerful victory that had saved lives and irrevocably changed his own. A gentle knock at the door interrupted his thoughts, and he looked up to see Laura standing in the doorway, her expression hesitant yet hopeful. Her younger brother Logan, never far from her side, clung to her shirt, his small hand resting against her back. "Can we come in?" Laura's voice had a soft vulnerability to it, still tinged with uncertainty. But there was also warmth and a growing sense of trust. Harold smiled, gesturing for them to come in. "Of course you don't need to ask," he replied warmly. Laura returned a tentative smile as she led Logan to the couch opposite Harold's desk. Logan climbed up beside his sister, his wide, curious eyes taking in the room around him. "How are you both doing?" Harold asked, leaning forward with genuine care. Laura nodded, her face lighting up slightly. "We're good. School's different, but in a good way." Harold smiled back, his heart lifting at the glimmer of hope in her eyes. "I'm really glad to hear that." Time would make it easier, he reminded himself. A comfortable silence settled over them, each of them savoring the quiet moment. Harold could hardly believe he had come to fill this role. Guardian, father figure. But in this moment, it felt undeniably right. The purpose and connection he found in taking care of Laura and Logan had filled the previously empty part of his life, not wealth or professional success. Logan's small voice broke the stillness. "You're really going to keep us?" His words were simple, but carried a weight that hung in the air. Harold looked down at him, a surge of emotion catching in his chest. "Yes, Logan," he replied gently. "You're staying here. You're family now." Laura reached over, her hand finding Logan's, as the two siblings exchanged glances, filled with relief and tentative hope. They had endured more hardship than any child should, and now, here they were, daring to believe in a future that held security, love, and the promise of a fresh start. As the sun sank lower, casting soft golden hues across the floor, Harold walked to the window, gazing out at the view of Dallas spread before him, the distant mountains glowing in the evening light. For the first time in years, he felt a calm, enduring peace, a peace born from knowing he had chosen compassion over isolation, family over solitude. A few weeks later, the courtroom held a solemn silence as the judge's gavel struck with finality, sealing the fate of Brenda Dudley. Harold sat in the gallery, watching her, along with several businessmen and officials who had turned a blind eye to the orphanage's mistreatment of children as they were led away in handcuffs. Justice had finally come, dismantling the dark network that had preyed on vulnerable children one piece at a time. But Harold's mind drifted, far from the sterile court benches and legal procedures, to the small home now bursting with laughter and warmth. Laura and Logan. Their names were etched in his heart as deeply as if they had been his children from the start. The adoption process had been grueling, fraught with endless paperwork and anxiety, but as he stepped outside the courthouse into the late afternoon, with long shadows stretching across the steps, the sense of peace he felt was incomparable. The legal journey was over. Harold Livingston was, officially, their father. He knew then that he had gained something no amount of success could buy: a family, a purpose, and a home filled with love. His ambitions were no longer driven by wealth or success in business. Instead, they had become deeply entwined with the little hands that reached out to him in trust, and the bright, hopeful eyes that now looked to him for love and protection. As he pulled into the driveway, he was greeted by the heartwarming sight of Laura and Logan playing in the front yard, their laughter ringing out under the warm afternoon sun. Laura, who had once been so guarded and hesitant around him, had blossomed into a lively and joyful child. Her laughter filling the air as she twirled around, her eyes gleaming with a happiness that Harold cherished more than anything. Logan, though still young, had grown more sure-footed and playful, toddling after her with his little feet pattering across the grass in joyful pursuit. "Dad!" Laura's voice carried over the yard as she spotted him, her arms reaching out as she ran toward him. Harold dropped to his knees, catching her in a warm embrace that seemed to hold all the joy in the world. In moments, Logan joined them, giggling as he wrapped his tiny arms around Harold's leg, until Harold lifted him into the hug too, holding them both tightly. "Did everything go okay?" Laura asked, her voice muffled as she rested her head on his shoulder. Harold nodded, his voice warm with reassurance. "Yes." Everything went just as it should. Together, they walked into the house, where the comforting aroma of a home-cooked meal welcomed them, a new skill Harold had taken up, much to the children's delight. The house had become more than just four walls. It was now a true home, filled with warmth, laughter, and a sense of belonging that Harold hadn't known he was missing. Dinner was a lively and heartwarming scene, with little Logan chattering non-stop about his adventures at preschool, his tiny hands gesturing animatedly as he recounted every detail. Laura, sitting beside him, joined in with stories from her day at school. Her voice filled with excitement as she shared moments she thought would bring a smile to her dad's face. Harold, with a soft, attentive smile, soaked it all in, savoring the joyful noise that filled the room, a comforting rhythm of laughter, voices, and the occasional clink of silverware. This was family, he thought, a precious gift he cherished more than words could say. Later, as the evening faded into a gentle stillness, Harold gathered the children onto the plush living room couch, pulling a well-loved storybook from the shelf. The warmth from the fireplace enveloped them, casting a soft amber glow across their faces, dancing with the flicker of each turning page. Harold's voice was calm, each word spoken with a cadence that seemed to soothe their young hearts. Logan and Laura drew closer over time, drawn in by the comfort and familiarity, their eyelids getting heavier as they leaned into him. When the final words of the story drifted into silence, Harold carefully lifted Logan, carrying him to his bed, where he tucked him in snugly, pressing a gentle kiss to his forehead. Returning to Laura, he watched as she, already half asleep, clung to his hand with a tiny but determined grip. He held her hand until, finally, she drifted fully into dreams. As he stepped back and stood quietly in the doorway, Harold took a moment to gaze at his two children. In that instant, he felt a love so profound it filled every empty corner of his soul. An overwhelming sense of belonging and the knowledge that he was deeply, irrevocably a part of something much bigger than himself had taken the place of the loneliness that had once plagued him. As he switched off the last light in the hallway and glanced back at his children's rooms, Harold felt a warmth settle over him. They had come a long way together, building a family not through blood, but through resilience and love. Their journey was far from flawless, and the road ahead would undoubtedly hold more obstacles, but they would navigate it side by side. For the first time in years, Harold felt a sense of true peace, a peace earned after a long struggle. Brenda and her accomplices were finally behind bars, unable to bring harm to another child. Justice had found its way, casting a light that made the world feel a little safer, a little kinder, and his home, once a place of quiet loneliness, now rang with the sound of love. There was warmth, joy, and the unassuming strength of a father and his children connected by something more enduring than blood in his home. Their bond was woven from trust, hope, and the shared belief in a future filled with endless possibilities and the promise of brighter days ahead.